Good morning, welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, today we are going to discuss types of rule. You know, majority of the country have adopted democracy, but still there are few countries which are following military authoritarianism. So today we will focus on military authoritarianism, its advantage, disadvantage, and what are the way to follow this type of governance. So, and for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap. She teaches in University School of Law and Legal Studies in one of the University of Delhi, Guru Gobind Singh Press University, and her specialization is Latin America. So I think her knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic. So on behalf, I welcome her for EduSet lecture. Welcome.
Good morning. Today's lecture is focused on the different types of rule that we have. We have already discussed democracy in the past few lectures. So today we will be talking about a deviation from democracy, and that is called military authoritarianism or military regime or military dictatorship. We call it under different names, but the case study that I am going to take up is specifically localized to Latin America. Now, as we already know that democracy is the ideal form of government, and in one of the last few lectures I had dealt with 7 prerequisites of democracy as per Robert Dahl, and where he talks about popular consent, people having ample choices and they giving their consent to have an elected leader. But this is an ideal situation, and there are many deviants from this ideal form, and there are 2 deviants which I had pointed out. One is one party democracy. The very fact that it is called a democracy means there is some form of election happening, there is some form of choices that people have. But in an authoritarian regime, the choices disappear. There is only one person who rules. But if we look at the first slide that I have brought in here, according to Linz, who tried to differentiate between totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and we would not call military dictatorship totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is basically exemplified by the rules of Mussolini and Hitler, and it is quite different from authoritarianism, and this is how I differentiate. Totalitarianism, there is a deep ideology present, whereas in authoritarianism there is absence of an elaborate ideology to guide the regime. If we look at how they interact with the masses, the totalitarians, they try to incite and mobilize the masses through the use of stirring speeches, and we know Hitler was famous for his speeches, how he would stir up the sentiments of the people and almost would convince them that the best use of one's life is if he participates in war. And on the other hand, in authoritarian regimes we find the absence of intensive or extensive political mobilization. Then in totalitarianism there is no political pluralism. In authoritarianism, on the other hand, there may be some kind of political pluralism. People may have some choices. If we look at the kind of leadership, the leadership in totalitarianism is arbitrary or discretionary, whereas in authoritarianism there is a limited leadership. Why we call it a limited leadership? Because they, at least at the facade of the rule, they try and be bound by some constitution or some kind of a rule of law, and that is why we call it limited leadership, whereas totalitarians are absolute dictators or absolute leaders. Now, if we go back to see how democracy emerged, it was either to come out of the shackles of colonialism, and in many of in the European context after the Treaty of Westphalia 1648, there were new democracies which were coming up on their own. If we look at the colonial context, we see that democratization was always happening to overthrow the colonial rules because for the deep desire and need for self-governance. Now, if we look at the colonial countries, these are mostly the underdeveloped countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America. So, once they desired democracy and they had democracy, they had problems in widening and deepening the democracy. They were nascent democracies, they did not know how to govern, and they had to give training for governance. And this was the period when they were just deliberating on how to manage the governance, and this is when many of them went back into adoption of authoritarian or military rules. Now, one thing about military rule was that these were the groups which had helped the countries come out of colonialism. So, they started realizing that we are the ones who had fought the colonizers, and therefore, we are competent enough or we are strong enough to govern on our own. And this arrogance started seeping in the military dictators, and this is when many of the democratic countries also, they did not know how to handle the problems, the socio-economic problems, the political problems. So, they were also happy to go back to some kind of an authoritarian regime, and that is why worldwide we saw the process of going back from democratization to military regimes. Now, if you look at the meaning of military regime, this military dictatorship emerges from Mao Zedong's famous aphorism, powers grow out of the barrels of a gun. So, if we are to exercise real power, the military must exercise that power, because according to Mao Zedong, we do not have soft power or no concepts of those. He only talked about barrels of the gun, and it is a rule by a distinctive organization which has its own uniform, barracks, it has its own career structure, and even the legal system. How they try people are also guided by their own legal system. For example, martial law, they have their own courts, military have their own courts to try people. And if we look at the extent of military dictatorship, surprisingly between 1950s and 70s, they ruled almost 1/3 of the world, so quite a sizable percentage. So, we must try and look into the anatomy of how and why military dictatorship succeeded in the world. Now, as I proceed in the lecture, I would like to just focus on why did military dictatorship emerge. Now, reasons for emergence, the first reason and the most important was there were intense inequalities in society, and inequalities breed a lot of conflicts, and then military tried to capitalize on these conflicts and then assumed power. Second reason for emergence, because we are looking in the context of Asia, Africa and Latin America, all underdeveloped but have immense natural resources. So, wherever there is abundance of natural resources, the erstwhile imperialist power or the capitalist countries, they have a vested interest in keeping those countries in their control somehow or the other. And what best way to control, but control them through some kind of a puppet rule, and this puppet rule in many of the cases were the military rulers. Third was, this is the people's take. The people are disappointed with the functioning of the civilian government. So, they also kind of do not want a civilian government. Then the civilian governments, the style of functioning, they are laid back, there are delayed decisions, and military, who is supposed to be very disciplined, very energetic, they also got disillusioned, and they just got restless, and they wanted that this style of functioning must go. We need firm rule, we need discipline, and therefore we must take over. And the last reason and the most important one is the military started realizing that it is a significant and an elitist institution. In most of the countries, they were the ones who were involved in driving away the colonizers. So, if they could take such a big step, why not rule? So, all these were the reasons which combined and led to the emergence of military dictatorship. Now, if we look at the characteristics of military dictatorship, we have to see that in the beginning they started as agents of ruling political elite. So, it was either the monarchy or the oligarchic group, and they were just the agents of the ruling political elite. But because they were giving more and more power to the military, it is when the military usurps power and it becomes more important than those people who had put them in power. The second characteristic is that they are elitist institution. If we look at the composition of the military rulers, most of them are from educated middle class background or the upper middle class background. They are well trained. Training is a part which invokes a kind of arrogance on them. They say that they are elitist because they have a special training and they are more disciplined and they are able to take tough decisions. So, all this make them an elitist institution. Now, the method in which they adopt power is called coup d'etat. So, they assume power through coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is a manner in which there is an overthrow of the existing government, and coup could be bloody coup or bloodless coup depending on what mode they adopt. But you can have a series of coup which may have failed or which may be unsuccessful, and then there is a successful coup. So, when the successful coup overthrows the civilian government and puts military in place. Sometimes there are coups against their own military leaders, and if we look at the composition of coup, the coups are mostly undertaken by the middle class officers. It is not the high rank officers or the military generals or leaders of the military that undertake coup. It is generally by the middle class officers, the majors or the colonels would undertake the coup. Then another characteristic of military is that they are against the traditional concept of neutral military. For example, in India, we practice neutral military. A military has a designated role and it cannot usurp the role of executive. And this is why we see there are certain situations in which the military's hands are tied to deal with the situation, because it is supposed to be neutral, only bringing about law and order, but not taking any political sides or political decisions. So the time that military assumes power, we cannot think of military as neutral. Now, it has political affiliations or leanings. The other characteristic is the lifespan is short. Lifespan is short because, you know, the very basis on which military has come to power is through violence or force, and force is disruptive. So, the force tends to destroy itself also. So, it cannot rule for long, because if they have used power, there would be some other group who is ready to use power against them. So, you cannot see a military dictatorship which is continuously ruling for a very long period. Of course, there have been exceptions like Pakistan or Chile, but they have been interspersed with short periods of democracy. So, we cannot say that it's absolute and it's very long. Then for example, you can say that Cuba has had military dictatorship for a very long time, but the context is different. The people there were happy because they were practicing the socialistic pattern, and Fidel Castro was a socialist or a communist leader. So, they were okay with not having democratic regimes. Then if we look at the place where a military dictatorship is emerging, we do not see them in developed countries. We see them mostly in underdeveloped and developing society. And as I told you in the earlier part of the lecture, that this is because these underdeveloped and developing societies are characterized by deep inequalities but abundance of natural resources, and controlling the natural resources then becomes the prima facie motivation for military to assume power. And the other characteristic is that it is never based on popular support, except I told you Cuba. Cuba, we can say that it is based on popular support, but in most of the cases the people are not happy with the military regime in place. Now, if we look at the different types of military, if we just have a look at the slide, there are different types of military regimes, and I am going to classify them on different bases. So, the first type of classification is based on the involvement, the degree of involvement of military in governance, and this classification has been given by Hermann Feiner in 1976. He classifies military dictatorship into two types, disguised and open. In open, we can see the military openly ruling and acquiring the supreme authority. So, they would be wearing their uniforms and then ruling. So they are not even ready to take up any kind of civilian hue to rule. So many of the leaders we see, they are wearing their military outfits, they are wearing their ranks, and then they are ruling. This is the open military dictatorship. And the other kind is called disguised, in which the military hides. It's indirect or it's civilianized. Indirect is when the military doesn't come on the face. The face is a civilian government, and that is backed and propped by a military government. This military government is using only the civilian face, but the policies and the decisions are being taken by the military, but we do not see the facade of military. And the other kind of disguised military leadership is called civilianized, in which it is the military person who is ruling, but he tends to do away with his ranks and his uniform. So he is not wearing the ranks, he is not wearing his uniform, but he dons civilian outfit and then he is ruling. So his training and his mindset is military, but his outfit is civilian. The second type of military dictatorship, according to Amos Perlmutter, this distinction was given in 1981. He distinguishes military into two types: autocratic, oligarchic, and corporate military types. What is an autocratic? It is an unchecked personal authority and popularly known as caudillo or single officer rule, very, very popular in Latin America, for example. And the two examples, glaring examples, are Idi Amin in Uganda and Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. The other is oligarchic, when the power is exercised by a few military men. It's a group which is exercising power, and it is often called rule by junta or a board of military officers. This is the kind which was practiced in Burma and Chile by Pinochet. Although Pinochet could be put in the first category, but he tried and maintained a facade of being an oligarchic leader. Corporate military dictatorship are of a different kind, in which the authority resides in a civil coalition of military and civilians. So there is a group which comprises of people from the civil background and the military background, and they are the ones responsible for ruling. So this is the best acceptable form of military dictatorship, and it includes technocrats and bureaucrats. And this is why, you know, when I discuss Latin America in the later part of the lecture, we go on to see that Latin America adopted mostly this corporate culture, and that is why it was called bureaucratic authoritarianism. There were bureaucrats and there were military dictators, and they were together ruling, and that is why it could last for so long. If we look at the corporate military rulers, Musharraf between 1999 and 2008 in Pakistan tried to practice this kind of a culture. Very important. Now, if there is a third type of military dictatorship which is based on the degree of intervention, how much force is the military using? If we talk about the extreme form, the army emerges as rulers and it has a distinctive executive, and this executive comprises only of the army personnel. And the other type is less extreme, arbitrator form. Arbitrator means somebody, a mediator or a go-between. So it operates from behind the scene and it does not have an executive of its own. The executive is civilianized. So that's why it's called a less arbitrary or less extreme form. The fourth type of military dictatorship is based on the rule that the military assumes. So this is the most important distinction. If you look at any of the articles or journals related to military dictatorship, these are the two kinds which is the most common distinction used. One is constitutional caretaker. So what is a constitutional caretaker? We may call it a temporary military government, because it comes with a agenda that it will just restore the constitution in a limited period and normalize the crisis and subsequently hand over the power to civilians and move out. So this kind of a temporary governance was promised by the Burmese military junta between 58 and 60, but it never happened because Burma ultimately went on to have a very long military regime. It is now only thinking in terms of democratization. And the other is programmatic. So, first is constitutional and the second is programmatic. The fine difference is the constitutional caretaker government just comes to normalize the crisis, and the programmatic comes with a particular agenda, and once the agenda is fulfilled, it goes back to the barracks. So, military steps in with specific agenda, and the agenda could be deep inequalities or distribution of resources or forging some kind of a peace in the society or holding elections. So, they have a program with which they come, and once that program is over, they do not stay on. But the catch here is that they do not propose a time frame. So, in the name of a program which could be a short term program, they go on to rule till n number of years, because the catch is that they do not propose a time frame. They come in, they step in to bring about some economic, social, political reforms, and the moment these reforms are done, they are supposed to step out. But you know, economic, social and political reforms are very, very fluid reforms. We do not know whether these reforms have taken place because the gestation period is long. So, the military may continue to rule till a very long period in the name of the reforms not having taken place. If we look at the examples, Juan Alvarado of Peru and General Ayub Khan in Pakistan during his regime 1958 to 71 could be labeled as programmatic military rulers. Now, generalizing, if we look at, we cannot say that military rules are bad always, but of course, the good points are far and few, but we cannot say that they are always bad, they are always negative, because at times the countries do need. If that was not the case, Cuba would not have evolved, Cuba would not have developed. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, all of them are on the threshold of becoming developed countries. They are in the higher rungs of developing countries, and Chile, for example, by 2018 should be a developed country, and all of these countries have had military dictatorship. So, we cannot say that military dictatorship is all bad, it is all negative. So, let us look at some of the advantages. If we look at the advantages, the first advantage that comes to our mind is that it eliminates competitive party based politics, and so true. You know, we can follow this advantage and apply it to the Indian context. In the present Lok Sabha elections, the party situation and the democratic process has become ugly, and there have been so many accusations of shelling out money to buy voters and using unfair practices and all this. But so these kind of competitive party based politics, and India's economy is not so good. So at this moment, for example, I am not prescribing, but I am just giving an example. For example, a country C has intense economic problems, and at the same time it wants to hold democratic elections and multi-party elections. So the amount of money that is wasted, the amount of money that is used to hold that electoral process, and then after the election, if there is a coalition power, if there is a coalition government in place, then it is also very tenuous, because at any moment it is a fragile democracy. The chances of breakdown of a coalition is very high, and so we have another election. So this this is an endless vicious circle. So you have elections, the result is a very fragile government, then again it breaks down, again elections. So a lot of money and manpower is wasted. So if we had military dictatorship in developing countries or underdeveloped countries, it would eliminate the competitive party based politics. Fair enough? The second advantage is that because the institutions of government, of the military, are disciplined and strong, and they are very efficient. So if they form the government, then we can expect the governance to be disciplined and strong and efficient. So time delays would be avoided, quick decisions would be taken. So all these are advantages. Now if we look at the third advantage, stability and efficiency can steer the country out of disorder and underdevelopment. So there are certain political thinkers who prescribe that to come out of underdevelopment, the panacea or the prescription is military, because the disorder and underdevelopment can be taken care of by an orderly government, a stable government, and that is the military. The other advantage is that people are unified. So people are unified in the sense that they are not pro-military. It's not they are unanimously favoring the military dictators, but being unified means that because they are either being suppressed or they are either being too happy about the performance of the government, that they have to be unified, they don't have chances of dissension. At least the military keeps them unified. And the other advantage, which I have already said, are prompt decision making. There are certain emergency like situations in which we cannot wait for democratic decisions. For example, in India, if we need quick Lokpal bill, or there is an emergency situation on any of the borders, to react or respond to that decision, we have to take the consent of the parliament. And the parliament's consent is a lengthy process. There are debates, there are conflicts, one house passes, the other house rejects. So this is a lengthy process. So prompt decision making is lost in the process. So if we want a quick decision and a quick reaction to any situation, emergency situation, then military dictatorship is the answer. Now if we look at the disadvantages of military dictatorship are that force and its use are glorified, and you know they say that force is a good thing to use, which is antithesis to democracy. Democracy is based on consent, whereas military governance is based on the use of force. And as I said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and then force is disruptive. So anything which you want to keep on the basis of use of force is going to break out or burst or explode due to the disruptive power or capacity. The other disadvantage of military governance is that civil and individual liberties are suppressed, and this is not rule of law. According to rule of law, individual liberties have to be guaranteed, but in a military dictatorship, individual liberties are denied. So this is antithesis to democracy, and this kind of an ideology is not liberal ideology, and it is an illiberal ideology, and therefore it does not find favors in many parts of the world. The third disadvantage is that the distinction between state and government is blurred. If as students of political science, we know that the state is not equal to government. State is equal to government only in cases of totalitarian rules or military dictatorship, because the government is only an agent of the state. The state will remain, the governments may come and go. The state has its own constitution, the government's role is to follow and implement that constitution. But in military dictatorship, more often than not, we find the rulers, they say that I am the state, I am the government, I am the law, and thereby eroding the distinction between state and government. Now, having said that, we also have to see the role of judiciary. If we look at the role of judiciary, the judiciary is supposed to be a neutral or impartial organization in a true democracy. But in a military dictatorship, we see that its impartiality is eroded, and it is made or forced to abide by the decisions or the policies of the military rulers. So the judiciary, if there is a decision to be given between an individual and a military, it always favors the dictators or the military rulers. So the individual liberty are lost. The other disadvantage is that military government is not a popular government. So the concept of popular sovereignty is not practiced, because it is not based on the will of the people. It is not the people who desired that that military dictator should be in place. It is the military dictator who himself had desired that he wants to be the ruler. The unquestioning obedience and strict discipline of the military, it breeds fear and mistrust, because every time if you try to follow you have to follow the policy of carrot and stick. Following the policy of stick always finds no acceptance within a popular government or a liberal democratic regime. So, people start mistrusting, people are fearful, and they are not able to deliver the best. Now, another disadvantage is that democracy, according to Robert Dahl, there has to be a public opinion created in order to vouch for democracy. Public opinion, dissenting views and individual creativity are not encouraged. All these are suppressed because these are the grounds of breeding differences or dissent against the military rulers. So, anything against themselves they will not like, and they try to suppress all this. So, having given a background, now we move on to the Latin American context, and we would like to look at the military in the Latin American context. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background before I begin. If we look at democratization, Latin America was unique. Now, there are certain things which were happening in Latin America. There were influences of different kinds on the Latin American polity, and these are some of the influences I have pointed out. The 7-year war between 1756 and 63, this was a war between Britain and Spain over control of this region, Latin America. Now, the other developments which were taking place in other parts of the world was the American and French Revolution. They were talking about fraternity, they were talking about individual liberty, and in this situation the Latin Americans were denied of individual liberty. So, this was another influence which was percolating on the Latin American hemisphere. The Spanish, now many of these countries were colonized. Latin America was mostly colonized by Spain and Portugal. Portugal had limited colonies, and most notable colony of Portugal was Brazil. Others were mostly colonized by Spain. Now, many of this, that is why it is called the Spanish American War of Independence. So, between 1810 and 25, many of these countries, they tried to assert independence from the colonizers, and they were able to do so. So, this period is called the period of wars of independence, and it was a 15-year period from 1810 to 1825. Then if we move a little further, the Cold War was happening after the end of the Second World War to the breakdown in disintegration of Soviet Russia. The Cold War was in place in most of the world, and even Latin America was not devoid of the influences of either Soviet Union and United States in Latin America. Then the situation in Latin America was so unique, the military rule was so unique that Guillermo O'Donnell in 1973, he coined the term bureaucratic authoritarianism for Latin America, and this is a special term and first explored by Guillermo O'Donnell, and he says, he goes on to say that why he calls it a bureaucratic authoritarianism, because it is a collaboration between civil and military officers, and the collaboration is such that it appears like a technical or technocratic bureaucratic regime in which due place are given to technocrats who may be civilians, and it is like a corporate state. So, this is the term which we must keep in mind while describing Latin America. Now, if we look at the reasons why creation of military took place in Latin America, the most important aim was to prevent or weaken the social and economic position of the landed oligarchy. and especially the Central American republics, we see that the oligarchy had such deep economic interest, and they were so deeply involved in assuming power that the military was wanting a place for itself, it wanted to exert itself, and the only way of displacing the oligarchy was through coups and then assuming power in the form of a military rule. So, this is very important. The second is that it had a role of moderator till a new arrangement was worked out in many of the countries. So, the people themselves said that yes, military should be in place till after independence. We worked out a formula and wrote a new constitution or reformed the existing constitution, and after that the military dictators would go, and the notable example is Brazil after 1889. In other countries, the reasons for creation of military was that the military so far had realized that it was an elitist institution, it had potential on its own, and it was disciplined, and it had to have power because it could not see the country being sliding into underdevelopment, and therefore they had their own independent ambitions, and they wanted to rule just to bring about law and order in the countries. So, the example here would be Mexico and Argentina. Now, if we look at the anatomy of military authoritarian regime or the characteristics, we have to look at the first factor, and that is that these were important factors that had emerged out of the wars of independence in Spanish America. So, because they were the ones who had helped in attaining of independence, they thought they were very important and they were elitist, and why not rule, because they knew of their capability by now. Now, the second important factor is that these were the first organized actors of independent republics, and these were now called the national army. So, this gave them a lot of confidence, and this gave them a lot of weightage that they were the national army and not the regional armies that were being led by the regional caudillos. So, this factor that they were the unified representative of the army gave a boost to their image. Now, the second important characteristic was that during the import substitution industrialization that many of the Latin American countries followed during the 50s, 60s and 70s, there was a creation of a military industrial complex, and many of these industries were substituting import, especially in the area of military productions. So, this ISI creation of military industrial complex also gave them the support of the industries, because the industries were mostly catering to the needs of the military. So, this backing, the economic backing or the trade backing came from the military industrial complexes. Now, if they had informal alliances with regional armies led by caudillos. So, many of the times these caudillos, because this was the caudillismo is a culture typical of Latin America. It is based on patron-clientele relationship. Now, such caudillos would work out informal alliances with the army, and they would then give their army support to the military. So, the military's support base started expanding. The other factor was US. US was constantly meddling in Latin America. It had a direct role because it would support the military industry. It would also give industrial training, because many of the most Latin American countries, they did not have military schools or military training. So, most of them were trained outside, and where that was Latin America, that was US. Now, US started directly intervening in many of the countries, and in other countries, if it was not intervening directly, it started giving indirect support through economic sanctions. So, this was the background in which US was trying to meddle throughout, and that is why when they were getting support and help from a developed world, they were also, their morale was high, they started becoming more confident in ruling the Latin American countries. Now, the other characteristic was, though inevitably authoritarian because they were authoritarian dictators, they implemented social, economic and political reforms, and that was what kept them going, because this gave them a kind of a base. They had certain reforms that they were undertaking in the economic fields, in the social fields, and that is why they could kind of get some popular support. Now, another important thing is about military is that they evoke extreme reactions. So, people are either staunch followers or they intense opposition. So, there is no midway for a military reaction to a military regime. Either you like it or you dislike it. There is no gray area. The other characteristic was that it was against the established oligarchy. The oligarchy was so deep rooted in Latin America that to upset the oligarchic dominance was very important. People couldn't do it, the political parties couldn't do it. So, the military thought that to upset the established oligarchic order was the only way to social mobilization or social mobility. So, for them it became a tool of social mobility to upset or destabilize the oligarchy, and this they did through staging of coups. Other characteristics, if we look at, they were allied to and enjoyed the support of the middle class. The middle class was the largest, biggest support base for these military dictators, because they were the ones who were disenchanted with the kind of development that was taking place, with the kind of rule that the political parties were undertaking. Then the military dictators were also associated with undertaking mega development projects, and especially the military, for example, if we look at the Brazilian military junta, we see they were megalomaniacs. They would have huge hydroelectric projects without doing any impact assessment study. They would just implement these projects, and the projects would at times fail, but the military was not bothered. They just wanted to implement and gain credence or credit for those projects. Then the Brazilian military dictators also supported certain agro-villas. Agro-villas were agricultural villages which were established along the trans-Amazonican highways. The highways were other grand project of the military dictators. They wanted to colonize the empty Amazons. They wanted to reach to the border of Brazil with the northern countries. So, to reach there, it was inaccessible. So, they had to build major roads. So, these were called trans-Amazonican highways, and these highways were failures because the soil of the Amazon rainforest is fragile. It cannot support heavy roads, and these heavy roads then would ultimately subside because the soil was loose. Now, along these highways, Brazil had planned small agricultural villages. These villages were created mostly to depopulate the congested urban areas, and the population, the farmer population, would be taken deep inside the forest, and there they would practice certain agricultural techniques, or they would do certain things which were very, very different or antagonistic to the nature of practices or things that they were practicing. Now, this mega development projects mostly were failed projects. Then we had another problem, that although they were anti-democratic, yet they were modernizing. So, this is how they got credit, because most of the times they were accused of being repressive, being anti-democratic, but when we looked at their performance, there were certain good things which were happening. So, this modernization practices kept the people happy. Then they practiced political exclusion. They only favored a particular class. They did not want the oligarchy to be involved in any ways. So they kind of created a class structure in the society. And this class structure then started dividing the society, and divide and rule was the basis on which the military continued to rule. They also exhibited a corporatist culture. If we look at the corporatist culture, it is, there's a writer called James Malloy who has written a lot on bureaucratic authoritarianism, and the corporatist culture, according to James Malloy, is a tripod of 3 units. If we have a triangle, then there are 3 points of the 3 angles of the triangle. The first is the state sector, the second is the foreign sector, and foreign sector means the foreign capital, and third is the domestic business. Now, if we look at the domestic business, it is also that niche or the elite class which the military was aiming and keeping them happy. So, if this is so, according to Malloy, this is a tripod, and this tripod kept development happening. Now, if we look at the outlook of the military dictatorship or military regime, it was nationalistic in outlook, and that was very important given the kind of colonization that Latin America had gone through. The nationalistic outlook was very important, because we can call them nationalistic because they were the ones who favored state-led growth. They were not for private enterprises. They said that it is the state which is the most important agent of development. So, any growth has to be state-centric. Now, another important characteristics and very important in terms of the foreign element or the interventionist element is that these military dictators, they were self-selected and self-trained, and because Latin America did not have any of the military academy or schools. So, these were self-selected, self-trained, not self-trained though, most of the time they got support from the US academies. So, they were not trained in the local ambience, or the local requirements were not incorporated in their training. So, they were like a transplanted military regime. So, that is one thing which is why military had failed, because they could not incorporate the local element. Now, if we look at military in developmentalist discourse, it is very important because the developmentalist discourse has been talking about different roles of military. If we look at the trajectory of economic development in Latin America since the 1930s, it is the military which is responsible for the state-centric growth. So, as I told you, they were pro-state. Second discourse in the military, in the developmentalist scenario is that military negated the theory of military intervention. And what is the theory of military intervention? It says that as democracies become strong, interventions would become rare, but this was not happening in Latin America. So, this theory of military intervention was being overruled or negated. Now, if we look at the nature of military, then Guillermo O'Donnell, he used the term bureaucratic authoritarianism to describe military regimes, especially in Brazil and Argentina. Now, if we look at how we would place them in the redistribution of resources, because that is one area which was the gray area in Latin America, because most of the Latin Americans were confused whether capitalism was good or socialism was good, and whenever socialism raised its hands because it talked about redistribution of resources by the state, was when the US would get alarmed and then it would intervene. So, it accorded primacy to growth and would be coercive in their aim for redistribution of resources. So, the military said, why leave the redistribution of resources to people? It is we who are ruling, so we are the one who can use coercive methods to redistribute resources, and this was not liked by many of the people. And the last discourse in developmentalist ideology is that they were able to put most countries on the path of economic growth because they were more disciplined, they had more focus, and although anti-democratic, but through adoption of certain good political and economic and social policies, they were able to put the countries on trajectory of growth. So this was how it was viewed. And the next is that during the ISI, as I told you earlier, the developmentalists argue that it had gained power because it was an important component of the civil military industrial complex, and especially we see this in Argentina, Brazil and Chile, that this military was the one which was keeping or propping the military civil complex. Now, if we look at the role of military since the 1980s, and we have seen that there have been different roles. There have been, the first has been the collaborative role. Collaborative role, for example, was seen in Argentina. If we look at Peru, Peru had a very dictatorial regime practiced by the military rulers. Pinochet, for example, was again a very, his regime is marked with the worst official crimes. The Brazilian rulers were not so oppressive as per se. Peru, for example, under General Alvarado in 1968, the revolution always for military came from above, and it was labeled as bourgeois revolution, and it was not the people who were wanting military dictatorship. So the main aim was, as I said, the first and the foremost, the moderating role, where the main aim was to keep the oligarchic powers from assuming supremacy and to put them in place. That was the first important role. The second important role has been that it has to defend the status that it had. For example, in Chile, they tried to do immunity for the armed forces. They said that we have continued to dominate and we will continue to dominate, and how do we do that? We put some clause in the constitution so that the powers of the military are retained. Then even if we have done some malpractices, or we have repressed people, or we have tortured people, we will, before we leave, we will try and acquire some immunity for the armed forces, so that when we leave and we go back, we are not tried for the repressive regimes that we have been practicing. So then we know about the truth commissions. There were truth commissions which were established, and these truth commissions were mostly into finding what were the type of repressions, and there's one allegation against these truth commissions, that they were not formed for actually giving practices to the punishments to the military dictators who had done repression. They were not. They were just trying to find out that these were the kind of repressions that were taking place, and they were just trying to ensure that these repressive things did not happen in future. Argentina is heavily criticized for these truth commissions. And the last role has been to return to the barracks. So back to the barracks is one slogan which was practiced in many of the countries. Now if you look at the problems with military regimes, Latin American military is grappled with these specific problems. First is because of the lack of military academy or military schools. They have low level of professionalism. They are not indigenously trained people. They have been trained outside and then just transplanted. So the level of professionalism to deal with an underdeveloped or developing country, they lack. The second problem was that they had political ambitions because they were drawn mostly from middle class. So you could not extricate themselves from politics. Somewhere down the line, they had political aspirations. And these political aspirations then resulted in the third problem, which is frequent coups to give vent to their political desire rather than correcting ills. These coups were not for correcting the problems or malice of the society. These coups were to acquire political ambitions. Then they viewed communists as subversive elements, and this is at the behest of United States. So wherever communism was raising heads, they would unnecessarily take over power, or they would use repression, because for them communist was equated with subversion. Then another problem was that the heavy dependence on US for their training and military support, material support, especially after the Second World War. So these were the problems which remained with Latin American military, and this is why then we moved towards democratization in most Latin American countries, and the process of democratization in Latin America has been unique because 1960s, 70s military rule was established in most of the Latin American countries. 1980s there is democratic transition in many of the Latin American countries, and the factors for democratic transition are many. There are certain domestic factors, there are certain regional factors, and there are certain international factors. So maybe I could take up the process of democratization in some subsequent lecture, and because the time does not permit. So I would like to conclude here by saying that we cannot equate military with repression all the time. We cannot say that military comes out because it has its own selfish desires. At times military comes for genuine reasons of taking out a country out of underdevelopment or dichotomous conflicts, but by far such examples are far and few. Most of the time the military has its own selfish interest, and this is what we have looked at in many of the countries. So to say that military is benign is hard to digest in the developmentalist context. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I thank Dr. Prajakta Kashyap for giving such a wonderful lecture, and I also thank all of you friends for watching the lecture. Thank you very much.